Mandalorian warships appear above every major battlefield. Thousands of them. Republic forces freeze, Separatist droids halt. Then the message broadcasts across all frequencies. Mandalore is done watching. We're taking the galaxy. Both of you can surrender or die. The Clone Wars just ended. Mandalore won, not the Republic, not the Separatists. The warriors everyone forgot about, the culture that stayed neutral, the deadliest fighters in galactic history just united and entered the war. And they're not picking sides. They're destroying both sides. Palpatine spent years orchestrating a war he controls from both ends, manipulating every battle, every treaty, every death. But he doesn't control Mandalore. He just lost everything. Warriors who've spent millennia perfecting the art of killing. Jedi and conquering galaxies just reminded everyone why the Mandalorian Wars nearly destroyed the old Republic. Duchess Satine's pacifism is gone. Death Watch terrorists and new Mandalorians united. Every clan, every warrior, every fighter scattered across the galaxy just came home. They have one mission: make the galaxy Mandalorian again. What if Mandalore won the Clone Wars? What if Beskar armor and warrior culture defeated clone armies and droid legions? What if the faction Palpatine couldn't manipulate conquered the factions he spent decades controlling? What if Jedi faced enemies who've been killing Force users for thousands of years and actually know how to do it? What if Anakin's path to darkness got cut off because Palpatine's too busy surviving warriors who don't fear Sith Lords? Everything changes. The Jedi Order faces extinction from their ancient enemies instead of from Order 66. Clone troopers fight opponents who make them look like children. Obi-Wan has to kill the woman he loves or watch her conquer the galaxy. And Mandalore proves that when warriors unite, when they stop fighting each other and focus outward, no army in the galaxy can stand against them. This is the timeline where honor and strength defeat manipulation and politics. Where the most feared culture in Star Wars stops being divided and becomes unstoppable. Let's explore how everything Palpatine built could shatter against Beskar armor and Mandalorian fury. Mandalore during the Clone Wars is a divided world. Duchess Satine Kryze leads the new Mandalorians, a pacifist government that's renounced the warrior ways of their ancestors. She's transformed Mandalore from a planet of conquerors into a neutral, peaceful society. The cities are gleaming and modern. The people are prosperous and safe. But underneath this veneer of civilization, the old warrior culture simmers with resentment. Death Watch, led by Pre Vizsla, represents the traditionalists who see Satine's pacifism as betrayal. They wear the armor, practice the combat forms, maintain the clans. They're terrorists in Satine's eyes, patriots in their own. They want to restore Mandalore's warrior heritage to make their people feared across the galaxy again. But they're scattered, disorganized, unable to overthrow Satine's government without outside help. Between these extremes are thousands of Mandalorians who don't fit either category. Former warriors who accepted peace reluctantly. Young people raised on stories of glory they'll never experience. Clans maintaining their traditions in secret, all of them waiting for something, anything, to give them direction and purpose. The catalyst that could unite them would need to be significant enough to make pacifists pick up weapons and extremists accept temporary alliance with those they hate. In canon, nothing quite reaches this threshold. Maul's takeover of Mandalore causes civil war, but not galactic intervention. The Republic and Separatists largely ignore Mandalore because Satine's neutrality serves both their interests. But what if the Separatists made a catastrophic mistake? What if Count Dooku, seeing Mandalore's strategic location and resources, decided that neutrality was no longer acceptable? What if he ordered a full-scale invasion, not just to occupy, but to enslave? To take every Mandalorian as labor for the war machine, to strip the planet of its Beskar and its people's spirit? The Separatist assault would be overwhelming. Thousands of droid ships in orbit, millions of battle droids landing across every city. Mandalore's minimal defense forces would be crushed in hours. Satine would broadcast desperate pleas for Republic aid, but the Senate would debate while her people died. The Jedi would be stretched too thin across too many battlefields to respond quickly, and in those hours of invasion, something remarkable would happen. Death Watch would come out of hiding not to overthrow Satine, but to defend their homeworld. New Mandalorian police armed with basic weapons would fight alongside warriors in full Beskar. Old veterans who hadn't worn armor in decades would dig out their equipment and join the battle. Every Mandalorian, regardless of faction, would unite against the invaders. Pre Vizsla and Satine would meet in the burning ruins of Sundari. Their mutual hatred would still be there, but survival would override it. Vizsla would offer his warriors. Satine would offer her resources and legitimacy. Together, they'd forge a temporary alliance to drive out the Separatists. And in that alliance, in the shared combat and shared loss, something deeper would form. The battle for Mandalore would be brutal. Droids don't fear death, but Mandalorians embrace it. The fighting would be close quarters, vicious, the kind of combat where superior individual skill matters more than numbers. Mandalorians would use their jetpacks for three-dimensional warfare the droids can't match. Their Beskar armor would shrug off blaster fire that kills everyone else. Their weapons, designed over centuries to be lethal and efficient, would tear through droid formations, but they'd be outnumbered 1,000 to 1. For every droid destroyed, 10 more would advance. The Mandalorians would win every engagement and still lose ground. Cities would fall despite heroic resistance. The death toll would climb into the hundreds of thousands, and the Republic would still be debating whether to violate Mandalore's neutrality to help them. This abandonment would radicalize the survivors. Satine would see that pacifism failed, that the Republic she trusted left her people to die. Vizsla would see that isolation failed, that hiding didn't protect them. Both would reach the same conclusion. Mandalore must become strong again, must unite fully, must ensure they're never victims again. The turning point would come when Mandalorian diaspora return home. There are Mandalorians scattered across the galaxy, mercenaries and bounty hunters and exiles who left when Satine imposed peace. They'd hear their homeworld is under attack, hear their people are dying, and they'd come back. Ships full of warriors arriving from every corner of the galaxy, bringing weapons and experience and fury. Jango Fett's legacy would matter here. He was Mandalorian, and his genetic template created millions of clone troopers. Some Mandalorians would see the clones as brothers, diluted but still family. Others would see them as abominations, stolen genetics used for slavery. But all would recognize the tactical implications. The Republic has an army wearing a Mandalorian's face, and that gives Mandalore leverage. Boba Fett, still young during the Clone Wars, would be pulled into this conflict. In canon, he's a lone bounty hunter seeking revenge for Jango's death. But in this timeline, he might return to Mandalore, might become a symbol of what was taken from them, might be raised up as a leader by warriors who see Jango's son as their prince. His youth wouldn't matter to a culture that values skill over age. The combined Mandalorian forces would drive the Separatists off their world through sheer ferocity. The cost would be enormous, entire cities destroyed, a generation of warriors killed, but they'd win, and in that victory, they'd be transformed. The new Mandalorians would understand that peace requires strength. Death Watch would understand that unity requires compromise. A new Mandalore would emerge, combining the best of both factions. Satine and Vizsla would formalize their alliance. She'd remain the political leader, the face of Mandalore to the galaxy. He'd become Mandalore the military commander, the leader of the armed forces. Together they'd represent a unified world, pacifist ideals backed by warrior strength. It wouldn't be easy or comfortable, but it would work because the alternative is extinction. This unified Mandalore would look at the Clone Wars with fresh eyes. They'd see the Republic as faithless allies who abandoned them. They'd see the Separatists as invaders who tried to enslave them. They'd see both sides as threats that need to be eliminated or controlled. And they'd have the military capability to act on that assessment. The Mandalorian military machine, fully mobilized, would be terrifying. Every adult Mandalorian is trained for combat from childhood. Their technology, particularly their armor and weapons, is superior to standard Republic or Separatist equipment. Their tactical doctrine, developed over thousands of years of warfare, is more sophisticated than anything the clone troopers learned in their brief existence. And they have something neither side can replicate: genuine warrior culture where death in battle is honor, not tragedy. The first major engagement between Mandalore and the other factions would shock the galaxy. Imagine a key Republic world, maybe Christophsis or Ryloth, where Republic and Separatist forces are locked in stalemate. Suddenly, Mandalorian forces arrive, and they're not asking permission or announcing sides. They engage both armies simultaneously, crushing them both, and claim the world for Mandalore. The Republic's response would be confused and panicked. These are supposed to be neutral pacifists. Why are they attacking? The Jedi Council would be especially concerned because they know Mandalorian history, know that the ancient Mandalorian Crusades nearly destroyed the Jedi Order. Know that these warriors have techniques and weapons specifically designed to kill Force users. The Separatists would be equally alarmed. Dooku would try to negotiate, would offer alliance, or at least non-aggression. But Mandalorians have long memories. They'd remember it was Separatist droids that invaded their world, killed their people, destroyed their cities. No amount of diplomacy would erase that. Dooku would find himself facing an enemy he can't manipulate or control. Palpatine would recognize this as a catastrophic development. His entire plan depends on controlling both sides of the war, on orchestrating events to create the conditions for his rise to power. But Mandalore is a wild card, a faction loyal only to itself, led by people who have no reason to trust him and every reason to hate both the Republic and Separatists. He can't control them, can't predict them, can't use them. His first instinct would be to eliminate them. He'd try to maneuver Republic and Separatist forces into crushing Mandalore together. But that's difficult when both sides are also fighting each other, and when Mandalorian forces are mobile and skilled enough to avoid encirclement. The logistics of fighting a three-way war are exponentially more complex than managing a two-sided conflict. Obi-Wan Kenobi would be personally devastated by Mandalore's entry into the war. His history with Satine is well documented. He loved her, perhaps still does, and he knows she's a woman of peace who's been forced into violence by circumstances. He'd want to negotiate, to find a peaceful solution, but the Jedi Council would be wary of his emotional involvement. Satine's feelings would be equally complicated. She'd remember Obi-Wan, would perhaps still care for him, but she'd also blame the Jedi and the Republic for abandoning Mandalore in its hour of need. When they meet again, it would be as leaders of opposing factions rather than as the young people who fell in love years ago. The tragedy of their relationship would mirror the tragedy of the war itself. Anakin's interaction with Mandalorian warriors would be significant. He respects strength and skill, and Mandalorians have both in abundance. Unlike the political machinations he despises, this is straightforward combat between warriors. He might actually enjoy fighting Mandalorians in a way he never enjoys fighting droids, because they're worthy opponents who test his abilities. But Mandalorians are also uniquely dangerous to Jedi. Their armor resists lightsabers. Their weapons include flamethrowers, rockets, whipcords, and other tools specifically designed to counter Force users. Their tactics account for Jedi abilities and include counters for them. Anakin would find that his usual advantages, his Force powers and lightsaber skills, are less effective against enemies who've spent millennia learning how to nullify those exact advantages. The first time Anakin duels a Mandalorian super commando and barely wins, or perhaps even loses, would be a humbling experience. He's used to being the best, used to overwhelming opponents with raw power. Against someone in Beskar armor who fights with ancient anti-Jedi techniques, his power means less. He'd have to actually outthink his opponent, use strategy and tactics instead of just Force-enhanced reflexes. This could actually be good for Anakin's development. It would force him to grow as a warrior and a thinker. It would show him that power alone isn't enough, that even the chosen one can be beaten by skill and preparation. It might even make him less arrogant, more willing to learn, more open to wisdom. This would make Palpatine's manipulation harder because Anakin wouldn't be as vulnerable to ego-based appeals. The clone troopers would have complicated feelings about fighting Mandalorians. They're genetically Mandalorian, created from Jango Fett's template. Some might feel loyalty to Mandalore despite their Republic conditioning. Others might see it as fighting brothers or fighting the culture their genetic father came from. The Kaminoans designed them to be loyal to the Republic, but genetics and culture might create unexpected conflicts. Some clone units might defect to Mandalore. Not many, not whole legions, but individuals or small groups who feel pulled toward their genetic heritage. They'd be welcomed, sort of, by Mandalorians who see them as corrupted kin that need to be taught proper culture. These clone defectors would form their own units, fighting to prove they're real Mandalorians despite their origins. The war would become a constantly shifting triangle of alliances and betrayals. Sometimes Mandalore would ally with the Republic against the Separatists. Sometimes they'd work with Separatist systems against Republic expansion. Usually they'd fight both, carving out their own territory in the chaos. No one could predict what Mandalore would do because Mandalorian strategy is based on honor and pragmatism, not on ideology or manipulation. Systems caught between the three factions would face impossible choices. Join the Republic and accept clone occupation, Join the Separatists and accept droid armies? Join Mandalore and accept warrior culture? Each option has benefits and costs. Some worlds would try to play the factions against each other, would negotiate with all three, would attempt to stay neutral. This rarely works well for them. The economic strain of a three-way war would be enormous. The Republic is already struggling to fund the clone army and the war effort. Adding a third front multiplies costs. The separatist megacorporations are pouring resources into the droid armies, but fighting two enemies instead of one stretches even their capacity. Mandalore has the smallest industrial base, but also the most efficient military, spending less per soldier because their warriors are volunteers who provide their own equipment. This economic reality would force political changes. The Republic Senate would have to raise taxes, would have to conscript regular citizens instead of relying solely on clones, would have to make the war's cost visible to populations that had been insulated from it. This would create domestic unrest, protests, political movements demanding peace at any price. Palpatine's ability to maintain his emergency powers would be tested. The Separatist Council would face similar pressures. The mega-corporations joined the Separatists for profit and power, not for endless expensive warfare. If the war stops being profitable, if it starts costing more than it gains, corporate support would waver. Dooku would need to promise victory soon or risk losing his financial backing. Mandalore's strategy would be unlike either opponent. They're not trying to conquer the entire galaxy or preserve a political system. They're trying to ensure Mandalore's security, gain resources to rebuild their devastated world, and restore their culture's prestige. This means they'd be selective about what they fight for, willing to negotiate when it serves them, and absolutely ruthless when their core interests are threatened. A Mandalorian siege of a major world would be different from Republic or Separatist sieges. They wouldn't try to preserve infrastructure or minimize civilian casualties. They'd blockade the planet completely, would bombard military targets from orbit, would land only when resistance is already broken. The goal would be submission, not occupation. Once a world surrenders, Mandalore would take what they want, resources or technology or recruits, and leave. This brutal efficiency would make systems terrified of attracting Mandalorian attention. Better to surrender immediately than resist and face devastation. Entire sectors might capitulate to Mandalore without a fight, calculating that Mandalorian rule is harsh but predictable, unlike the chaos of the Clone Wars. This psychological warfare, this reputation for overwhelming force, would expand Mandalorian influence faster than their actual military could conquer. The Jedi Order would face an existential crisis. Mandalorians have killed more Jedi throughout history than any other group. The Mandalorian Wars, thousands of years before, nearly destroyed the Order and led to Revan's fall. Now that ancient enemy has returned, united and aggressive, and the Jedi are already spread thin by the Clone Wars. Fighting on three fronts, with enemies specifically equipped and trained to kill them, would push the Jedi to their breaking point. Some Jedi might propose abandoning the Republic military role entirely. The Order wasn't meant to be generals and soldiers. They're supposed to be peacekeepers and diplomats. The Clone Wars force them into roles that compromise their principles, and adding Mandalore to the equation makes it worse. These Jedi would argue for returning to the Temple, for meditation and study, for letting the Republic fight its own war. Others would argue the opposite. The galaxy needs the Jedi now more than ever. Abandoning the fight would mean millions of deaths, would mean failing their duty to protect the innocent. These Jedi would push for even greater military involvement, for developing new tactics to counter Mandalorian advantages, for becoming the warriors the situation demands. This philosophical split within the Order would weaken it at the worst possible time. Yoda would try to hold the Order together to find balance between these positions, but even his wisdom might not be enough. The Jedi could fracture, with different. Palpatine would try to exploit this division. He'd encourage the militarist Jedi, would push them toward darker methods and moral compromises. He'd use the pacifist Jedi as scapegoats, blaming them for Republic defeats. He'd try to turn public opinion against the Jedi entirely, painting them as either warmongers who perpetuate conflict or cowards who abandon their responsibilities. Either narrative serves his long-term goal of destroying the Order. But with Mandalore in the war, Palpatine's timeline for Order 66 becomes uncertain. He needs the Jedi weak and discredited, needs the Republic desperate enough to accept authoritarian rule, needs Anakin fully corrupted. The chaos of a three-way war might accelerate some of these conditions but delay others. He'd have to be flexible, ready to execute his plan when conditions are right, rather than on a predetermined schedule. Dooku's position would become increasingly precarious. He's playing his role as separatist leader while secretly serving Sidious, but Mandalorian aggression complicates this. The Separatist Council would demand he take decisive action against Mandalore, would want revenge for their invasion and for ongoing losses. But Sidious might want Mandalore to continue disrupting both sides, might order Dooku to avoid fully committing against them. This conflicting direction would put Dooku in an impossible position. He's supposed to lead the Separatists to controlled losses that serve Sidious's plan, but his followers want real victories against real enemies. If he fails too obviously, the Council might remove him. If he succeeds too well, he disrupts Sidious's plan. The addition of Mandalore makes this balancing act nearly impossible. Dooku might start considering betrayal, not against the Sith necessarily, but against Sidious specifically. If the plan is falling apart anyway, if Mandalore has introduced too much chaos for Sidious to control, why not seize power for himself? Dooku is a Sith, and Sith are defined by ambition. The opportunity to rule the Separatists genuinely, to build his own empire rather than serving as Sidious's tool, might be too tempting to resist. The question of whether Mandalore could actually win the Clone Wars depends on defining victory. They can't conquer the entire galaxy. They don't have the numbers or the industrial base. But they could carve out an empire of their own, could control key sectors, could force both Republic and Separatists to negotiate from positions of weakness. They could restore the Mandalorian sector to its ancient glory, could make their culture dominant across hundreds of systems. The logistics of sustaining Mandalorian expansion would be challenging. They'd need to hold territory, not just raid it. They'd need to govern conquered systems, to extract resources and maintain order. This requires infrastructure and bureaucracy, things warrior cultures traditionally struggle with. Mandalore would need to adapt, to develop civilian government structures that support their military, to become more than just conquerors. Satine's pacifist background would be valuable here. She knows how to build institutions, how to create prosperity, how to govern effectively. Combined with warrior strength, her administrative skill could create a Mandalorian state that's both powerful and functional. The new Mandalorian cities, rebuilt after the Separatist invasion, would serve as models for how to organize conquered territory. But there would be constant tension between warrior culture and civilian needs. Mandalorians value honor and combat prowess, not bureaucratic efficiency. They respect leaders who fight, not administrators who manage. Satine would face resistance from traditionalists who see government as weak, who want to rule through strength alone. She'd need Vizsla's support to maintain authority, and he'd need her expertise to make their conquests sustainable. The Mandalorian chain of command would be different from Republic or Separatist structures. It would be based on clan affiliations and personal honor rather than formal ranks. The best warriors would lead regardless of their birth or political connections. This meritocratic approach would make Mandalorian forces adaptive and innovative, but it would also create coordination challenges when different clans want to pursue different strategies. Inter-clan rivalry would be a constant concern. Mandalorians are as likely to fight each other as to fight external enemies. Traditional grudges and competitions for prestige would threaten unity. Satine and Vizsla would need to channel this competitive energy outward, to make conquest and victory the path to honor instead of internal conflict. This means always having external enemies, always having battles to fight. This need for constant warfare to maintain unity would make peace nearly impossible for Mandalore. They'd become locked in a cycle where stopping expansion means internal collapse. This is sustainable for a while, maybe years or even decades, but eventually they'd overextend. They'd conquer more than they can hold, would face resistance they can't suppress, would encounter enemies they can't defeat. The Republic's trump card would be the Jedi, specifically Jedi who understand Mandalorian culture. Obi-Wan knows Satine, knows how she thinks. Other Jedi have studied Mandalorian history and tactics. The Order has institutional memory of the Mandalorian Wars and the strategies that eventually defeated them. If the Republic could set aside political concerns and let the Jedi develop a comprehensive anti-Mandalorian strategy, they could turn the tide. That strategy would involve isolating Mandalore, cutting off their supply lines, and forcing them to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Mandalorians are superior individual warriors, but they're not numerous. Spreading them thin, Making them defend everything they've conquered while also pushing into new territory would strain their resources. Eventually, they'd have to choose what to hold and what to abandon. The Republic would also try to exploit divisions within Mandalorian society. Not all Mandalorians are warriors. Not all support expansionist war. The civilians who just want to rebuild their lives, the clans who lose too many warriors, the conquered peoples who resist occupation, all of these could be leveraged. The Republic might find Mandalorian allies willing to work against the warrior government, but this assumes the Republic survives long enough to implement such a strategy. The three-way war is devastating. Clone casualties are mounting. Jedi are dying at unprecedented rates. Public support for the war is collapsing as costs spiral. The Republic might fragment before it can defeat either the Separatists or Mandalore. Palpatine would face a decision point. Does he try to salvage his original plan, using the chaos to become Emperor? Or does he cut his losses, abandon the Republic, and build power through different means? His Sith identity is still secret. He could fake his own death, disappear, and regroup. He could join Dooku openly and try to seize Separatist leadership. He could even approach Mandalore, offering Sith knowledge in exchange for position. The most likely path is that Palpatine accelerates his timeline. He'd execute Order 66 earlier than planned, before Anakin is fully corrupted, before the Jedi are as weakened as he'd like. It would be messier, less controlled, but the alternative is losing control entirely. The clone troopers would turn on their Jedi commanders across the galaxy, and the purge would begin. But with Mandalore in play, Order 66 would be less effective. Some Jedi are fighting Mandalorians when the Order comes, and Mandalorians aren't subject to clone control. A Jedi might escape pursuing clones by fleeing to Mandalorian lines, might survive because they're in a battle where clones can't safely betray them without being killed by nearby enemies. The survival rate for Jedi might be 20 or 30% instead of the single digits of canon. These surviving Jedi would scatter. Some might join Mandalore, might offer their services to the warrior culture in exchange for protection. This would create the bizarre situation of Jedi fighting alongside Mandalorians, ancient enemies united by Palpatine's betrayal. The Mandalorians would be suspicious, would watch the Jedi carefully, but they'd also recognize the value of having Force users on their side. Other Jedi would try to rally Republic forces loyal to the Order rather than to Palpatine. They'd expose the Chancellor as a Sith Lord, would call for his arrest and trial. This might work in some sectors where local commanders are more loyal to Jedi generals than to distant Coruscant. It would create a Republic civil war, with Palpatine-loyal forces fighting Jedi-loyal forces while both are also fighting Separatists and Mandalorians. The galaxy would descend into utter chaos. 4 or 5 major factions, dozens of smaller ones, all fighting simultaneously. Trade would collapse. Entire sectors would become war zones. Refugees would flood neutral systems. The death toll would climb into the billions. This is the nightmare scenario where the Clone Wars never end, where they transform into a galactic dark age that lasts generations. Mandalore might actually thrive in this chaos. Warriors understand chaos. They're trained for it, equipped for it, culturally adapted to it. While everyone else struggles to maintain order and supply lines and political legitimacy, Mandalorians just fight. They take what they need from the defeated. They move fast and strike hard. They don't worry about governing peacefully because they're not interested in peace. In this scenario, Mandalore doesn't win by conquest, but by attrition. They survive while others collapse. They maintain unity while others fracture. They keep fighting while others exhaust themselves. After years of multi-sided war, after the Republic splinters and the Separatists dissolve and Palpatine's empire never solidifies, Mandalore would be the last organized force standing. The galaxy that emerges from this would be radically different from anything in canon. Mandalore would control the core worlds, the military and industrial heart of galactic civilization. Thousands of systems would pay tribute to Mandalore, would send warriors and resources to Sundari, would adopt Mandalorian culture to prove loyalty. The common language might shift toward Mandoa in official contexts. Beskar would become the standard for elite equipment across military forces, but it wouldn't be a unified empire. Mandalorians don't build empires the way Palpatine does. They'd rule through a network of allied clans and vassal states, with local leaders maintaining autonomy as long as they provide warriors and tribute. Different sectors would have different arrangements based on how they were conquered and what they can offer. Some would be tightly controlled, others barely supervised. This decentralized structure would make Mandalorian dominance resilient, but also vulnerable. There's no single capital to attack, no central government to decapitate, but there's also no unified command, no coordinated grand strategy. Different Mandalorian leaders would pursue different goals, would come into conflict with each other, would recreate the clan rivalries that weakened them before. Eventually, perhaps within a generation, the Mandalorian Empire would fracture. A particularly ambitious clan leader would try to centralize power, others would resist, old grudges would resurface. The cycle would repeat. Unity forged in external war, collapse through internal conflict, weakness inviting external intervention. It's the Mandalorian pattern, repeated throughout their history, but for a time, for those years or decades of dominance, the galaxy would be Mandalorian. Warrior culture would be ascendant. Honor and strength would matter more than wealth or political influence. The arts of war would be the most respected profession. It would be a harder, more violent galaxy, but also perhaps a more honest one, where power comes from proven capability rather than manipulation and lies. The Jedi Order would have to find its place in this Mandalorian galaxy. Some Jedi might integrate with Mandalorian culture, might become warrior monks who combine Force abilities with Mandalorian combat techniques. Others might retreat to the unknown regions or other remote areas, might preserve traditional Jedi teachings in isolation. The Order would survive but transformed, adapted to a galaxy where their ancient enemies rule. Anakin Skywalker's fate in this timeline is uncertain. He might die in battle against Mandalorians, might fall to the dark side through different circumstances than canon, might actually find balance by learning from warrior culture. Without Palpatine's constant manipulation, without the specific circumstances that led to his fall, Anakin could become almost anything. If he survives, if he and Padme are together, Luke and Leia would grow up in a Mandalorian-dominated galaxy. They might be raised as warriors, might learn Mandalorian combat techniques alongside Force training. They could become something unique, Jedi warriors in the Mandalorian tradition, bridging two ancient cultures, representing a synthesis that neither could achieve alone. The sequel trilogy era would be completely unrecognizable. No Empire, no First Order, no Sith dominating the galaxy. Instead, maybe a Mandalorian Empire in decline, fragmenting into clan wars. Maybe a resurgent republic trying to reclaim the core worlds. Maybe a new threat from the unknown regions taking advantage of galactic weakness. The possibilities are endless because the foundation is so different. But let's explore the specific mechanics of how Mandalore sustains and expands their dominance. The initial conquest would be the easy part. Mandalorian warriors are superior to clone troopers and battle droids in individual combat. Their technology gives them advantages their enemies can't match. Their tactics, honed over millennia, are more sophisticated than anything developed during the clone wars. But holding territory and governing conquered systems requires different skills than taking them. The Mandalorian approach to occupation would be brutal, but efficient. They wouldn't try to win hearts and minds. They'd impose order through overwhelming force and the credible threat of retaliation against resistance. A conquered world would be given clear terms: provide tribute, provide warriors for Mandalorian forces, maintain order, and you'll be left largely alone to govern yourselves. Rebel and entire cities burn. This approach would work surprisingly well in a war-torn galaxy. Many systems are exhausted by years of fighting between Republic and Separatists. They've been bombed, invaded, occupied multiple times. The Clone Wars have made them cynical about idealism and desperate for stability. Mandalorian rule offers that stability. It's harsh, it demands sacrifice, but it's predictable. You know where you stand. Follow the rules and survive. Some worlds would resist anyway. Pride, ideology, or simple hatred of conquerors would drive them to fight despite the hopelessness of their situation. These rebellions would be crushed with calculated brutality. Mandalore would make examples of rebel worlds, would broadcast the consequences of resistance across their growing empire. Not genocide, but devastation sufficient to terrify other potential rebels into submission. The key to Mandalorian success would be selective enforcement. They don't have enough warriors to occupy every world personally. Instead, they'd install local leaders who understand the terms and enforce them. These collaborators would govern day to day, would maintain order, would extract tribute. Mandalore would only intervene directly when the collaborators fail, or when serious resistance emerges. This system creates opportunities for exploitation and corruption. Local leaders might take more than the required tribute, might abuse their power, might create conditions that breed resentment. Mandalore would need to balance allowing local autonomy with preventing abuse that destabilizes their empire. Too much oversight and they're stretched thin. Too little and rebellions become constant. Satine would be crucial to developing these administrative systems. Her experience governing New Mandalore, her understanding of how to build institutions and create prosperity, would inform the imperial structure. She'd push for regulations that prevent the worst abuses, for accountability mechanisms that give conquered peoples some recourse. She'd argue that sustainable empire requires not just fear, but also some degree of legitimacy. Vizsla and the warrior clans would resist this. They'd see regulations and accountability as weakness, as compromising Mandalorian strength with soft civilian concerns. They'd want to rule through pure dominance, to let local leaders do whatever they want as long as tribute flows and warriors are provided. The tension between Satine's administrative approach and Vizsla's warrior approach would define Mandalorian governance. The compromise would be a hybrid system. Local leaders would have significant autonomy but would face periodic inspections by Mandalorian warriors. If the inspectors find the population dangerously oppressed, if they see conditions that will inevitably breed rebellion, they'd remove the local leader and install someone more competent. Not out of compassion, but out of pragmatic recognition that sustainable rule requires preventing explosion-level pressure. The tribute system would be carefully calculated. Mandalore needs resources to rebuild their homeworld, to maintain their military, to expand their fleet. But they can't extract so much that worlds are impoverished and unable to function. The tribute rate would vary based on each world's capacity, with richer worlds paying more, poorer worlds paying less. This creates incentive for worlds to develop economically, because prosperity means they can afford their tribute more easily. Warriors would be the most valuable tribute. Young beings from conquered worlds would be conscripted into Mandalorian service, not as slaves but as trainees. They'd be taught Mandalorian culture, combat techniques, codes of honor. The best would earn their armor and become true Mandalorians regardless of birth species. This isn't just exploitation. It's expansion of what it means to be Mandalorian from ethnic identity to cultural identity. This cultural assimilation strategy would be controversial among traditional Mandalorians. Some clans would insist that only those born on Mandalore or to Mandalorian parents can truly be Mandalorian. Others would argue that Mandalorian culture is defined by adherence to the code, by proving oneself in combat, by earning the armor. This debate would shape how the Empire develops and whether it can maintain cohesion across diverse populations. Boba Fett's role would become increasingly important as the Empire expands. As the son of Jango Fett, the template for the clone army, he represents a bridge between Mandalore's warrior tradition and the broader galaxy. He could be positioned as a symbol, a young warrior who embodies what Mandalore seeks to create. Fighters of extraordinary skill who choose Mandalorian culture and prove themselves worthy. If Boba embraces this role, if he allows himself to be elevated as a leader rather than remaining a lone bounty hunter, he could become the face of the new generation of Mandalorians. Those conscripted from conquered worlds would see someone not born on Mandalore who nonetheless became a legendary warrior. It would give them hope that they too could earn their place, could become true Mandalorians through deed rather than birth. But Boba is damaged, traumatized by watching Mace Windu kill his father. His canonical path is one of isolation and revenge. Redirecting that into leadership would require intervention, probably from Satine, who might see in him a wounded child who needs guidance as much as a symbol the Empire needs. The relationship between the pacifist Duchess and the vengeful boy could be the emotional core of Mandalore's transformation. The military structure of Mandalorian forces would evolve as they incorporate warriors from conquered worlds. Pure Mandalorian units, those composed entirely of warriors from the homeworld or traditional clans, would be the elite. They'd handle the most difficult missions, would be the tip of the spear in major campaigns. Mixed units, combining traditional Mandalorians with proven warriors from conquered worlds, would be the main occupation and garrison forces. This creates a clear hierarchy and path for advancement. A conscript starts in a mixed unit, proves themselves in combat, earns the trust of their Mandalorian commanders, and might eventually be accepted into a pure unit or even lead their own mixed unit. It's meritocratic in the way warrior cultures can be, rewarding skill and courage regardless of origin. But it's also stratified, maintaining Mandalorian supremacy at the top levels. The fleet would be a major focus of expansion. Mandalore has excellent individual warriors, but limited naval capacity compared to the Republic or Separatists. To project power across the galaxy, they'd need capital ships, carriers for their fighters, logistics vessels for supply. This means either capturing enemy ships or building their own, both of which require resources and industrial capacity. Conquered shipyards would be high-value targets. Any system with the capability to build or repair large vessels would be secured and put to work for Mandalore. The shipbuilders would be offered a choice: work for Mandalore and be treated well, or resist and watch their facilities destroyed. Most would choose cooperation, especially if Mandalore pays them and provides protection from Republic or Separatist retaliation. The Mandalorian fleet design philosophy would emphasize speed, firepower, and boarding capability. They don't want to slug it out at range. They want to close quickly, disable enemy ships, and board them. Ship-to-ship combat is just a prelude to the real fight. Mandalorians in boarding pods cutting through hulls, fighting enemy crews in close quarters, where Beskar armor and superior combat skills give them overwhelming advantage. This creates terrifying scenarios for Republic and Separatist naval forces. They're used to space battles being about long-range bombardment and starfighter engagements. Suddenly, Mandalorian ships are ramming through their formations, launching boarding parties and turning ships from inside. Crews would panic, would flee, would surrender rather than face Mandalorian warriors in the corridors of their own vessels. The psychological impact would be devastating. Grievous would be one of the few enemy commanders who could effectively counter Mandalorian tactics. He's a cyborg warrior who specializes in close combat, who's trained in lightsaber techniques and killed many Jedi. In boarding actions, Grievous would be one of the only non-Mandalorian fighters who could match them. The battles between Grievous and Mandalorian boarding parties would be legendary. Brutal close-quarters combat between killers who respect each other's skills even as they try to destroy each other. The eventual confrontation between Grievous and Vizsla would be inevitable. Both are warriors who define themselves through combat. Both lead their forces personally from the front. Both see themselves as the ultimate expression of their respective warrior traditions. When they finally meet in battle, it would be gladiatorial. A duel between champions while their armies watch and wait for the outcome to determine who wins the larger battle. Vizsla has the Darksaber, the ancient Mandalorian weapon that's both lightsaber and symbol of leadership. Grievous has 4 lightsabers taken from defeated Jedi and cybernetic enhancements that give him inhuman speed and strength. The duel would be vicious, testing both warriors to their absolute limits. The outcome would shape both the war and Mandalore's future, because if Vizsla falls, someone would need to take the Darksaber and lead the military, and succession among Mandalorians is often violent. Let's explore the scenario where Vizsla defeats Grievous in single combat. The Separatist forces would break and flee without their commander. The Mandalorians would claim a major victory and enormous morale boost. Vizsla would become a living legend, the warrior who defeated the Jedi killer, proof of Mandalorian superiority. This would consolidate his power and accelerate Mandalorian expansion. But victory would also make Vizsla more ambitious and less controllable. He'd see his triumph over Grievous as validation that Mandalore should pursue total conquest, should aim to rule the entire galaxy rather than carve out a regional empire. He'd push for more aggressive campaigns, for attacking stronger targets, for taking risks that Satine would consider reckless. The balance between them would shift, with Vizsla's prestige giving him political leverage over the Duchess. Alternatively, if Grievous wins and kills Vizsla, Mandalore faces a succession crisis. Who takes the Darksaber? Who leads the military? Traditional Mandalorian law says whoever defeats the previous leader in combat claims leadership. But Grievous isn't Mandalorian, can't lead the clans. Does the Darksaber pass to whoever defeats Grievous? Or does the weapon return to Satine as the political leader of Mandalore? Or do the clans fragment, each following their own leaders, destroying the unity that made them powerful? Satine taking the Darksaber would be symbolically powerful but practically complicated. She's not a warrior. She can't lead troops into battle. Her claiming the weapon would be seen as legitimate by some, as new Mandalorians maintaining control, but as illegitimate by traditional warriors who believe only combat prowess grants leadership rights. She'd need to immediately designate a military champion, someone to lead in her name, which creates its own complications. Boba Fett could emerge as that champion if he's been built up enough as a symbol. He's young, but he's skilled and he has the right bloodline. If Satine champions him, if she frames his ascension as honoring Jango Fett's legacy and representing the new Mandalore where birth doesn't matter as much as ability, it might work. But he'd need to prove himself quickly, to win battles and earn respect, or the clans would reject him. The Republic's strategy for countering Mandalore would evolve as the threat becomes clearer. Initial responses would be defensive, trying to hold key worlds and prevent Mandalorian expansion. But eventually the Republic would need to go on offense, to attack Mandalorian holdings and force them to defend on multiple fronts. This requires coordination between clone forces and Jedi that accounts for Mandalorian advantages. The Jedi would develop specialized anti-Mandalorian units. Small teams of Jedi who've studied Mandalorian tactics, who train specifically to counter Beskar armor and flamethrowers and anti-force weapons. These teams wouldn't fight Mandalorians head-on in their preferred close-quarters combat. Instead, they'd use guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strikes, sabotage, assassination. They'd target Mandalorian leadership and logistics rather than trying to defeat their warriors in direct combat. Obi-Wan would likely lead the development of these tactics. His knowledge of Mandalore and his relationship with Satine give him insights others lack. He'd understand Mandalorian culture well enough to predict their strategies and identify weaknesses. But this role would pain him because he's using intimate knowledge of people he cares about to kill them more effectively. Every Mandalorian warrior who dies to tactics he developed would weigh on his conscience. His internal conflict would intensify if he's deployed against Mandalore directly. Imagine Obi-Wan leading a strike team to assassinate a Mandalorian commander, only to discover it's someone from Satine's government, maybe even someone he met during his time on Mandalore years ago. He'd have to choose between completing the mission and betraying a personal connection. These impossible choices would grind away at his commitment to the Jedi path. Satine would face similar anguish if she learns Obi-Wan is specifically targeting Mandalorian forces. The man she loved is now her enemy, is killing her people, is using knowledge of her culture against her. She might try to reach out, to negotiate, to find some way to end the fighting without more death. But political realities would make this nearly impossible. Her warriors would see negotiation with the Jedi as weakness. The Republic would see it as a trap. A secret meeting between Obi-Wan and Satine, arranged through back channels and hidden from their respective sides, would be emotionally devastating. They'd see each other for the first time in years, would remember what they meant to each other, would feel the impossible distance between their current positions. She'd ask him to stop killing her people. He'd ask her to withdraw from conquered territories. Neither could agree without betraying everything they've committed to. The meeting might end with them acknowledging that they're on opposite sides of a war neither wanted but both are trapped in. They'd part knowing they might face each other in battle, knowing one might kill the other or order their deaths. It would be the final death of their relationship, the moment when duty and circumstance completely override personal feelings. This tragedy would mirror the larger tragedy of the war consuming everything decent in the galaxy. Anakin's development in extended combat against Mandalorians would be crucial to his character arc. In canon, Palpatine manipulates him through years of war, gradually corrupting him through moral compromises and fear for Padme. But in this timeline, Palpatine is distracted by managing the chaos of three-way war, has less time for focused manipulation of Anakin. The war itself becomes the corrupting force rather than Palpatine's deliberate guidance. Fighting Mandalorians would force Anakin to confront his limitations. He's the chosen one, incredibly powerful, but Mandalorians have killed Jedi for millennia. Their weapons and tactics neutralize many Force advantages. Anakin would lose battles, would see warriors he respects killed, would face enemies he can't simply overpower through raw strength. This could humble him, could teach him wisdom, or it could frustrate him into seeking more power through darker means. The question of whether Anakin falls to the dark side in this timeline depends on several factors. Padme's safety and the nightmares about her death are critical. If she's safe on Naboo or another secure location, if the nightmares don't come or Anakin handles them differently, he might not be vulnerable to Palpatine's promises of dark side power to save her. But if she's in danger, if Mandalorian forces threaten Naboo, Anakin might seek any source of power to protect her. Anakin encountering Mandalorian culture directly could influence him. He respects strength and directness. Mandalorians value both. They don't hide behind politics or manipulation. They state their intentions clearly and fight openly. This honesty might appeal to Anakin more than Jedi philosophy with its restrictions and compromises. He could find himself sympathizing with Mandalorian values even while fighting Mandalorian warriors. There's a dark possibility where Anakin actually joins Mandalore, not as conquest or corruption, but as choice, if he becomes disillusioned enough. With the Jedi, if he sees Mandalorian honor as superior to Jedi hypocrisy, if he believes he can protect Padme better outside the Order, he might defect. Anakin Skywalker in Mandalorian armor, fighting for Mandalore, would be a nightmare scenario for the Republic and a massive propaganda victory for Mandalore. Palpatine would try to prevent this at all costs. Anakin joining a faction Palpatine doesn't control would ruin his plans for creating Darth Vader. He'd increase his manipulation, would try to bind Anakin closer to the Republic and to himself personally. But if Anakin is physically distant, fighting Mandalorians on the front lines, while Palpatine is managing politics on Coruscant, the manipulation is harder to maintain. The relationship between Anakin and Padme would be tested by extended separation. In canon, they're able to see each other periodically despite the war. But if Anakin is constantly deployed against Mandalorian forces, often in deep space or contested territory, they might go months without contact. The stress of separation, the fear for each other's safety, the uncertainty about when they'll reunite, all of this could strain their secret marriage. Padme might become more involved in trying to end the war politically. She'd work with Bailey, Organa, and Mon Mothma to find diplomatic solutions, to open channels with Mandalore, to negotiate peace that doesn't require total victory for any side. But this puts her at odds with the Republic's military strategy and potentially with Anakin's role as a general. She'd be arguing for peace while her husband fights for victory. This political versus military tension could create conflict between them. Anakin might see Padme's peace efforts as naive, as not understanding the reality of what Mandalorians are doing to Republic worlds. Padme might see Anakin's continued fighting as perpetuating a cycle of violence that benefits no one except those who profit from war. They'd love each other but disagree fundamentally about how to proceed, creating distance even when they're together. If Padme becomes pregnant in this timeline, the stress would intensify. Anakin would be desperate to protect her but unable to be present. The nightmares about her dying in childbirth would terrify him. He'd look for anyone who promises they can help, which makes him vulnerable to Palpatine's manipulation or to other dark influences. The pregnancy could be the catalyst that pushes him toward darkness even without Palpatine's direct involvement. The birth of Luke and Leia during the ongoing war would create immediate security concerns. They're the children of a Jedi general and a prominent senator. They're potential targets for kidnapping or assassination by any of the war's factions. Protecting them would require extraordinary measures, probably hiding them somewhere secure with guards and secrecy protocols. This means Anakin and Padme barely see their children, adding to their anguish. Mandalore might actually be the faction most interested in the twins. Force-sensitive children are rare and valuable. If raised and trained by Mandalore, they could become powerful assets. Mandalorian Force users who combine warrior culture with abilities no other Mandalorians possess. A Mandalorian strike team might target Padme specifically to capture her and the children, to bring them back for indoctrination. Imagine Anakin arriving to find Padme missing, taken by Mandalorian commandos. His rage and fear would be uncontrollable. He'd tear across the galaxy hunting for her, would kill anyone who got in his way, would embrace the dark side in his desperation to save his family. This could be his fall, not through Palpatine's manipulation, but through his own choices driven by love and fear. If Mandalore has Padme and the twins, they become the ultimate bargaining chips. Satine might treat them well, might even sympathize with Padme's situation, but she'd recognize their value. She could offer their return in exchange for Republic concessions, for territorial deals, for recognition of Mandalorian conquests. Or she could keep them indefinitely, raising Luke and Leia as Mandalorians, creating Force-sensitive warriors loyal to Mandalore. Anakin negotiating with Mandalore for his family's return would be agonizing. He'd have to deal with people who respect strength, who would see his desperation as weakness. He'd need to demonstrate value, to offer something Mandalore wants more than they want: hostages. Maybe he offers himself, agrees to serve Mandalore for a period in exchange for Padme and the children's freedom. Or maybe he challenges their champion to single combat, stakes his family's freedom on his ability to win a duel. A duel between Anakin and a Mandalorian champion would be spectacular. Anakin's lightsaber and force powers against Beskar armor and anti-Jedi weapons. His raw power against their skill and experience. The fight would test him more than any battle he's fought, would push him to his absolute limits. Victory would prove his worth and secure his family. Defeat would mean losing everything. If Anakin wins and recovers his family, the experience would change him. He'd have proven he could defeat Mandalorian warriors on their terms, in single combat without tricks or politics. He'd have saved Padme, through personal strength rather than through institutional power. This might actually strengthen him, might give him confidence in his own abilities separate from the Jedi Order or Palpatine's influence. But if he loses, or if Mandalore refuses to honor the agreement, Anakin's fall would be complete. He'd embrace. The dark side fully would become a monster hunting Mandalorians across the galaxy. Without Palpatine's guidance, his dark side persona would be less calculated than Vader, more chaotic and driven by rage. He'd be powerful and terrifying, but also unstable, potentially dangerous to everyone, including himself. The Republic's ultimate strategy for defeating Mandalore would require accepting massive casualties and devastating large portions of the galaxy. They'd need to be willing to destroy Mandalorian-held worlds to prevent their use as bases. They'd need to accept that Jedi would die in large numbers fighting enemies specifically designed to kill them. They'd need to maintain political will through years of brutal warfare with no guarantee of victory. This level of commitment would be difficult for a democratic society to maintain. The Senate would be full of voices calling for peace, for negotiation, for ending the bloodshed, even if it means accepting Mandalorian dominance of some territories. Palpatine would work these divisions, would use the war's cost to argue for stronger centralized authority, for emergency powers that let him prosecute the war without Senate interference. In this context, Palpatine might still achieve his goal of becoming Emperor, just through a different path. He'd position himself as the only leader strong enough to defeat Mandalore, would promise victory if given absolute power. The Senate, desperate and afraid, might grant him imperial authority even without Order 66, even with the Jedi still active. The Empire would form not through betrayal, but through democratic choice under duress. This empire would be different from the canonical one. The Jedi would still exist, might even serve the Empire willingly if they believe it's necessary to defeat Mandalore. The military would be led by experienced clone commanders rather than Imperial officers with no battlefield experience. The transition from Republic to Empire would be gradual rather than sudden, making it harder to pinpoint when the change happened, and therefore harder to resist. Palpatine as Emperor facing Mandalore would be an interesting dynamic. He finally has the power he sought, but he faces an enemy that doesn't fear him, that can't be manipulated through the Force or politics, that fights on terms he doesn't control. He'd need to actually be the strong military leader he's pretended to be, would need to develop genuine strategy rather than just manipulation. The Empire versus Mandalore would be a war of industrial capacity against warrior quality. The Empire can produce endless ships and troops. Mandalore has limited numbers but superior individual capability. Victory would go to whichever side can impose their preferred style of warfare on the other. If the Empire forces large-scale fleet battles and mass infantry combat, they win through attrition. If Mandalore forces small unit engagements and boarding actions, they win through skill. The development of the Death Star would be accelerated in this timeline. Palpatine would see it as the ultimate answer to Mandalore. You can't out-warrior a warrior culture, but you can threaten to destroy their worlds if they don't surrender. The Death Star would be positioned not as a terror weapon against the rebellion, but as the instrument that forces Mandalorian submission. Mandalore's response to the Death Star would be predictably aggressive. They wouldn't negotiate or surrender under threat. They'd attack it, would send everything they have to destroy it before it can be used. This would be a massive space battle, potentially the largest of the war, with Mandalorian forces knowing they're fighting for their species' survival against a weapon that could end them. If Mandalore destroys the Death Star before it's fully operational, it would be a devastating blow to the Empire. The resources invested in the project would be wasted. The promised solution to the Mandalorian problem would fail. Palpatine's political position would weaken. But if the Death Star survives and destroys Mandalore's homeworld, the war effectively ends. The Mandalorian diaspora would continue fighting, but without their cultural center, without Sundari and the clan's traditional territories, they'd be guerrillas rather than a conquering empire. The destruction of Mandalore would create one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes in galactic history. Billions dead in an instant. A culture thousands of years old, one of the oldest and most significant in the galaxy, wiped out. The surviving Mandalorians would be consumed by grief and rage, would wage a campaign of revenge that might never end. Every Mandalorian warrior would become a dedicated enemy of the Empire, fighting until death. This creates the scenario where Mandalore doesn't win but doesn't lose either. The Empire destroys their homeworld but can't destroy the culture. Mandalorian warriors scattered across the galaxy continue fighting, become the core of resistance movements, train others in their techniques. The Empire technically wins the war, but faces endless insurgency from an enemy that will never forgive. Never surrender, never stop fighting. Decades later, in what would have been the original trilogy era, the galaxy is still scarred by the Clone Wars that never really ended. The Empire controls the core worlds, but faces constant Mandalorian terrorism. Resistance cells across the galaxy use Mandalorian tactics and sometimes include Mandalorian warriors. The cost of maintaining order is enormous, requiring military presence everywhere, bleeding the Empire's resources. Luke and Leia in this timeline, if they survived everything, would be adults shaped by very different experiences. They might have been raised by Mandalorians if Padme was captured, might have grown up in hiding if Anakin and Padme kept them secret, might have been separated like in canon but for different reasons. Their roles in the galaxy would depend entirely on who raised them and what they learned about their heritage. Force-sensitive children raised by Mandalorians would be fascinating. They'd learn to fight from the best warriors in the galaxy. They'd understand honor and strength as core values. They'd have Beskar armor and Mandalorian weapons. But they'd also have Force abilities that most Mandalorians lack, making them unique and potentially powerful beyond normal limits. They could bridge the gap between Force users and Mandalorians, proving both can coexist. The final question is whether Mandalorian victory would have been better or worse for the galaxy than Palpatine's Empire. The Empire was totalitarian and evil, ruling through fear and oppression. Mandalore would rule through strength and honor, harsh but somewhat meritocratic. Neither is ideal, but Mandalore's rule might allow more freedom in areas that don't threaten their security. Local governments would have autonomy as long as they provide tribute and warriors. The answer probably depends on your values. If you value order and stability above all, the Empire is better because it's more organized and controlled. If you value strength and merit, Mandalore is better because they respect ability regardless of species or birth. If you value freedom and democracy, both are terrible. There's no good answer. Just different flavors of authoritarian rule with different characteristics. What if Mandalore won the Clone Wars? They'd create an empire based on warrior values, where strength earns respect and honor matters more than politics. It would be harsh and demanding, but also more honest than Palpatine's regime. It would be unstable in the long term, likely to fragment through clan rivalries, but powerful while united. And it would prove that even the most brilliant Sith plan can be destroyed by a variable the planner didn't account for. Warriors who refuse to be manipulated, who enter a controlled war and turn it into genuine chaos, who fight for their own goals rather than serving anyone else's grand design. The lesson of Mandalore winning the Clone Wars is that control is an illusion when you're dealing with beings who value honor over survival, who see death in battle as glorious rather than tragic, who unite when threatened despite their internal divisions. Palpatine orchestrated a war between two sides he controlled, but he couldn't control a third side that entered on its own terms for its own reasons. That's what makes this scenario so compelling. It shows the limits of manipulation when confronted by genuine warrior culture that won't be used as anyone's tool.